Hi, today we're going to talk about some basic forging techniques. Forging is the process of shaping metal using a hammer. The metal can be hot or cold. We often think of forging as hammering hot steel. However, today we're going to be demonstrating a tapering technique using copper wire. Before we start actually hammering, we're going to talk about hammer face shape and direction of force. The shape of the face of the hammer that you use will determine in which direction the force will be applied. In this case, we have a cross-peen shape, and on this planishing hammer, the face is round. When a hammer has a round face, the force is applied in all directions. Therefore, the deformation will also be applied in all directions. With a cross-peen hammer, the force is applied in two directions perpendicular to the axis of the face of the hammer. That also means the deformation will move in those directions. For example, if you strike an object with a circular cross-section with a hammer that has a round face, the cross-section will expand in all directions. However, if you strike an object with a cross-peen hammer, the deformation will be greater in the directions that are perpendicular to the axis of the face of the hammer. Okay, before we get on to the actual hammering, let's talk about one more thing: strike force and how that affects the shape of your piece. Strike force, that kind of sounds like an 80s TV show. Anyway, what I mean by strike force is how hard you hit the piece with the hammer will determine the type of deformation and where it is in the piece. So think about rivets. If you hit the top of the rivet lightly, the force only applies down into the rivet a small area, and therefore the deformation only occurs in the very top of the rivet. That's what causes the head of the rivet to mushroom out. However, if you hit the rivet harder, the force goes deeper into the rivet and causes the rivet to bulge out further down the body of the rivet. Okay, so why is this important to know? Well, sometimes you may want to only deform the surface. However, for example, today in our tapering demo, we want to move as much of the cross-section as possible, so we'll have to hit it a little harder. Okay, let's get started with some actual hammering. Today I'm using a piece of annealed 6-gauge copper wire, a hammer with a cross-peen type face. In this case, it is a bordering hammer, but later I will change to a raising hammer, and some vice grips. For this, you don't need to change hammers. I just felt like the raising hammer would be more effective after I had done the first round with the bordering hammer. The vice grips aren't absolutely necessary, but I find that it makes it easier to hold the piece as well as determine where the 90-degree points are. Okay, I'm starting by just lightly tapping the wire, not to actually form it, but just to tap the lumps out to make it straight. There's some important things to know about how you hold your piece. You need to make sure that the cross-peen of the hammer is perpendicular to the direction you want the metal to move, and you also need to make sure that your hammer blows are parallel to the face of the anvil. Begin hammering where you want your taper to start and hammer toward the end of the piece. Try to hammer evenly and consistently. It's also helpful to move the piece instead of the hammer. Now flip the piece over and do the same on the opposite side. You may need to straighten out some bumps. Do this before you're hammering. Once you've finished the second side, make sure to hammer out any curves there might be and rotate the piece 90 degrees. Do the same on that side, and then flip it over 180 degrees. Let's speed this up a little bit, shall we? Now that we've hammered all 4 sides, we should be getting a square cross section. Next, do another round just as you did before, except this time, start a little lower down on the wire, closer to the end of the wire. Notice I changed how I was holding the piece. That's okay as long as your hammer is in the right direction in relation to how you want to move the metal. Again, I frequently go through and correct any curves in the metal that I see before I start the next round. And keep on hammering. It's just about time to anneal. You have to anneal periodically because as you hammer it, the metal gets harder and harder and will eventually crack if you don't anneal often enough. Okay, the piece is now annealed and cleaned off and nice and dry. You'll notice that I've switched hammers, largely because the hammer I was using was putting too much bite in the metal, so I got one with a slightly wider, rounder face. It may be difficult to see here, but if you look at the end of the wire, the cross section is not exactly square anymore. Fear not, all is not lost. There is a way to correct it. All you need to do is hammer all 4 edges of the square to make an octagon, and then make it square again. Once you have it square again, keep hammering and annealing with each course moving further down toward the end of the wire until you have it the shape you want it. Once your taper is roughly the shape you want, now it's time to start making it round again. Just like you did when you had to re-square your cross section, turn your taper onto the point and hammer all the edges of the square till you get an octagon. Once you've hammered all your edges, now it's time to change hammers. Next, we're going to smooth out the shape using a planishing hammer. Planishing hammer has 2 sides. One side is ever so slightly rounded and the other side is flat. I'm going to use the slightly rounded side. This will help prevent me from accidentally marring my work. Planishing smooths out the piece. We continue to hammer the piece while rotating it, but we are using a series of much lighter blows in a tapping sort of motion to take out some of the previous marring from the heavier hammer blows. This may take several rounds to get to the smoothness that you want. You can continue planishing to whatever finish you prefer. At this point, it's pretty smooth and I could sand the rest or I could continue planishing.